Hey, this is Dane from featherprep.com. Thanks for joining me again today. I have been walking through the Olivet Discourse, which is found in Matthew chapter 24, taken section by section. Let's just get right into it today. Matthew chapter 24, and beginning with verse 35. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. Stop right there. So up until this point, if you've been watching these videos, you know that I have been talking about the Olivet Discourse and how I believe that Jesus was talking only about the destruction of the temple. That's what he predicted. That's what the disciples asked him about. And I think logically we can walk through there and we can see, based on the language that he used, the language that's used in the Bibles, and other even non-biblical evidences, historical evidences, that what he was talking about was the destruction of the temple. Now here, I do sense a change, and I want to talk about that a little bit today. But I will tell you that I labored long and hard over this section quite some time ago, because I just couldn't figure out for sure if there was a change. It's subtle, but it's subtle enough, I believe, to mark a change. And I know not all Christians would agree. There are some Christians who believe that Jesus is still talking about 70 AD and the destruction of the temple from this point forward. But I have to respectfully depart their company at this point, because I don't see it any longer. And I'm going to explain why. Jesus said here that heaven and earth will pass away. Now that sounds a little apocalyptic, and I talked before about the lights in the heavens going out and how the prophets use that type of language, but this isn't exactly that. Matter of fact, it's similar, not exactly the same, but it's similar to what's found in 2 Peter chapter 3. There we read in verse 10, "But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up." Here we talk about heavens passing away, and certainly the earth is being burned up. And Peter was one of the four disciples that was sitting in front of Jesus, according to Mark 13, during the Olivet Discourse. Peter heard this discourse, and he heard what Jesus had to say. And here Peter is talking about heaven passing away and the earth being burned up. Similar, not the same, but similar language. Now some would say, but isn't Peter talking about 70 AD? Well, I would be receptive to that, but there are some problems with that. Earlier in chapter 3 of 2 Peter, he cites some scoffers who will be coming, and they will say, "Where is the promise of his coming? Since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation." So Peter says that during the last days, now it could be the last days of the Jewish order or the last days of time, it's not really clear, there will be scoffers who come and challenge believers and saying, "Hey, where is this coming? Ever since our fathers fell asleep, it's been going the same." The problem with that is Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple, and he said it would occur in this generation. So in the same generation that heard it also saw the destruction of the temple. There would be no reason for people to say, "Hey, our fathers and our grandfathers' fathers have died, and no one has seen anything." That's too much time. Peter's talking evidently here about a great lapse in time, and so I don't believe he's talking about 70 AD. He must be talking about a later event, and I believe that would be Christ's second coming. The angels talked about that in Acts chapter 1. The same Jesus that you see go up into the clouds will return, and I believe that's the reference here of heaven and earth passing away. But that's not the only reason why I believe that. I also believe there's other, even better evidence to suggest that Jesus is talking about something other than 70 AD. Back in Matthew chapter 24, in the next verse, verse 36, Jesus said, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only." Now that's interesting. He said, "of that day." This is the first time in the Olivet Discourse that Jesus refers to a particular day, a particular point in time. The word day was found elsewhere in the Olivet Discourse, but it's always plural, days. For example, if you go back earlier in the Olivet Discourse, verse 19, for example, "But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days." Verse 22, "And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened." Here Jesus is not referring to a particular point in time, but by referring to those days, he's talking about a set period of time, a block of time, an era, for example. In those days, this is what's going to happen. This is subtle, but it is an observable shift in language. He said, "Now of that day." But he hadn't talked about a particular day yet, so what day is he talking about? I believe it's in verse 35. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not. And of that day, meaning the day that heaven and earth pass away. So I think now Jesus has shifted the language. The topic has been shifted, and he's referring to something not 70 AD, but something else. Interesting, in John chapter 6, Jesus is having a discussion with the Jews, and he tells them, for example, in verse 40, and this is the will of him who sent me, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up the last day. Then down in verse 44, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up the last day. Certainly Jesus is talking about a particular point in time, and I believe that day in John chapter 6 is the same day that Jesus is talking about in Matthew chapter 24. Kind of technical, I understand, but it's enough for me to say, okay, we're talking about something different here, and I think now Jesus has turned his attention to the his second coming, what we might call that, the end of time judgment. So he's referring to that day. Of that day, no one knows. In fact, in Mark's gospel, Jesus even says, I don't even know, only the Father in heaven knows about that. Now, in verse 38, he says, for as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will be the coming of the Son of Man. He just described how no one's going to know about it. And then he relates to the days of Noah, plural days, not day, but days of Noah. In the era of Noah, he said people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, and no one expected it. No one saw it. He had just said that no one knows when this day is going to come. And then to drive this point home, remember the days of Noah. And now it's interesting, I hear sometimes preachers saying, well, before Christ's return, it's going to be evil, is just going to be at its worst. It's going to be at a fever pitch, and maybe it will, but you can't rely on this verse to prove it, because Jesus doesn't say anything about the evil of Noah's day. He just said people will eat, they will be drinking, they will be getting married, they will be giving their children in marriage. People will just be living normal lives. They don't see it coming. Now, what's interesting in in Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse, it doesn't contain this, but it's in another chapter. In Luke chapter 17, we find a parallel here and of the days of Noah, but also he includes in verse 28, likewise as it was also in the days of Lot. They ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. So Jesus even adds this warning as well, just like it was in Lot's day. Now, Lot was in Sodom, very evil city. Sin was really bad. But Jesus does not make a reference to sin as being a sign of his coming. Matter of fact, he seems to suggest everything will be going on normally. People will be eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage. They'll be planting fields. They'll be eating. They'll be drinking. They'll be building. They'll just be going about life, not expecting judgment, not expecting this very, very swift judgment from God. Again, so many times I've heard preachers talk about, well, these signs that we're seeing, such as sin, is an indicator that Jesus is going to soon return. Even though it may be he may be soon to return, I don't know that. That's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that people will just be going about their lives unaware that they're about to face the judgment seat of Christ. And so I think that's what Jesus is trying to drive here, that point home in Matthew chapter 24. Then in verse 40, he says, then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be in the grinding mill, one will be taken, the other left. Watch therefore, for you don't know what hour your Lord is coming. Now, oftentimes people talk about the rapture in these verses, and it may be that, but again, Jesus seems to be referring that no one's going to be expecting this. Judgment is going to come. People are just going to be out among their daily lives, in the mill, grinding, doing the things that they do, and the judgment of Christ is going to come. Now, interesting, in Luke chapter 17, if we go back there, Luke adds something else also, and that is in verse 34. I tell you, in that night there will be 2 men in one bed. The one will be taken and the other will be left. 2 women will be grinding together. The one will be taken, the other left. 2 men will be in the field. The one will be taken, and the other left. And they answered and said to him, Where, Lord? So he said to them, Wherever the body is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Jesus in Luke's gospel even goes on about this. Now, sometimes I've heard it said that where it says 2 men will be in bed, they're talking about sin again, and I don't believe that that's the case. In the East, it was not uncommon for even men who maybe were working together on farms to be sleeping in the same bed, especially in cold temperatures, just to kind of keep warm. I don't believe that's what Jesus is talking. Incidentally, it's interesting. He said that, some people will be sleeping, some people will be awake, some people will be in the fields working. So evidently this is a global event where on one part of the world it's night and the other part of the world it must be day. What's interesting though here is he said one will be taken, one will be left. And the disciples say, Where, Lord? In other words, where are they going to be taken? And he says, wherever you see the eagles, wherever the body is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Meaning, just look up for the vultures circling, and wherever the vultures were circling, you will find their bodies. So Jesus seemed to be suggesting that the ones taken are the ones taken in judgment, and you can find them by looking for the vultures circling ahead. I don't know if he probably does not mean that literally, but I think that's the implication here, is that those who are taken in judgment, just like in the days of Noah, just like in the days of Lot. They did not see the judgment coming, and they were taken. And with that brings our study of Matthew chapter 24 to a close. In short, I believe that Jesus was mostly talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, all of the signs that he predicted. As we walk through all of them, they were displayed, they were seen by witnesses, and I believe that if we compare it to the language being used, for example, in the Old Testament, we can see how those things have already taken place. So when I hear preachers talking about the things that are going on today and what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24, I have some serious doubts about that, because I don't believe that Jesus was talking about now. He was talking about that generation, except for the end, as we just talked about. I think Jesus is talking about his second coming. And with that, I am going to close. Thanks for traveling along with me on this journey, and hope to see you next time.